Everyone thought it would be just another calm, uneventful flight, until one passenger decided to force Chuck Norris out of his seat. He did something no one expected, and within seconds the entire business class froze. Even the pilot couldn't believe what happened next. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. The morning at LAX felt like the kind of morning that promised nothing unusual. The airport was alive with its usual blend of rushing footsteps, rolling suitcases, and muffled conversations, all layered beneath the steady hum of ventilation systems and the occasional distant announcement. The air carried the faint, sterile scent of polished floors and recycled air, mixed with the sweetness of overpriced pastry shops scattered along the concourse. People moved with purpose. Families gathered, business travelers checked watches, and tourists stared at glowing departure boards as though deciphering a secret code. In this organized chaos walked a man who, despite being instantly recognizable, moved as if he belonged to the background. Chuck Norris had long ago mastered the art of passing through crowded places without disturbing the natural flow. He walked calmly, neither in a hurry nor wasting time, his presence powerful yet silent. A few people spotted him, their faces lighting up in recognition, but Chuck politely nodded or gave a small half-smile that signaled kindness without encouraging interaction. He was not unfriendly, merely tired, and he hoped this flight would grant him the peace he rarely found on the ground. His steps were steady as he followed signs through wide glass corridors bathed in white daylight. He passed by cafes filled with early travelers clutching steaming cups, by shops selling magazines and noise-canceling headphones, and by families herding children toward distant gates. Every now and then someone lifted a phone, hesitating. Should they ask for a photo? But something in Chuck's calm demeanor told them this morning wasn't the right moment. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't irritated, but he wore the unmistakable expression of a man who simply wanted to get where he was going without fanfare. When he reached his gate, boarding for the business class cabin had already begun. The attendant scanned his ticket with an efficient gesture, and Chuck stepped onto the jet bridge, feeling the familiar shift from airport acoustics to the narrow metallic echo of the tunnel that led to the aircraft. The air inside the jet was cooler, sharper, touched with the faint underlying smell of fuel and disinfectant. Chuck entered the business class section and felt an immediate drop in noise. The polished interior was softly lit, with beige leather seats arranged in neat, inviting rows. Overhead bins hissed shut, seatbelt buckles clicked, and the subdued murmur of privileged travelers filled the space. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, settled into his wide seat, and exhaled. The cushioning embraced him gently. For the first time that morning, he let his eyes close for a moment. It had been a long week: public appearances, charity events, a brief TV interview, several meetings. He valued people, loved contributing to causes, but the constant movement was draining. This flight was supposed to be a pocket of tranquility where he could breathe. He had just leaned back more comfortably when he sensed movement beside him. Someone was maneuvering into the row with a force that didn't match the calm atmosphere of the cabin. Chuck opened his eyes and glanced sideways. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a fitted jacket and an expression that seemed permanently twisted in irritation, shoved a carry-on bag toward the overhead bin. His movements were abrupt, unnecessarily loud, and accompanied by muttered complaints about the airline, the seating, the boarding process. Anything he could think of. Chuck observed quietly. Something about the man's face suggested a constant battle with whatever life presented him. There was bitterness in the set of his jaw, resentment in the tightness around his eyes, and an undercurrent of hostility in his movements. When the man finally dropped into the seat beside Chuck, he exhaled sharply, as though the world had personally wronged him. Then he turned, eyes narrowing, and recognized his neighbor. The reaction wasn't admiration or surprise. It was annoyance sharpened into jealousy. His gaze traveled from Chuck's boots to his shirt, up to his face, and tightened further. Chuck had seen that look before. Some people resented success not because they envied fame or wealth, but because the presence of someone well-known made them feel smaller, as though their own life weighed less on the invisible scale of worth. Chuck gave a polite nod, the kind that usually diffused tension, but the man didn't nod back. He scoffed quietly, sharply, just loud enough for Chuck to hear. "Great," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. Chuck chose not to react. The engines outside rumbled as the final passengers took their seats. Flight attendants performed last-minute checks, their shoes tapping softly against the aisle floor. Chuck settled deeper into his seat, telling himself to ignore the unpleasantness. The world was full of people with bruised egos and unsettled hearts. Not everyone who bristled was dangerous. Sometimes they were merely hurting. But as the aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate, Chuck felt, with the precision of long experience, that this man's irritation wasn't the fleeting kind. It was something festering beneath the surface, something that might soon spill over. The plane taxied smoothly. Through the small oval window, the runway stretched out, shimmering under the bright Los Angeles sun. As the nose of the aircraft lifted and the engines roared with steady rising force, the cabin vibrated. People leaned back in their seats as the jet climbed through layered air. Chuck remained composed, his breathing slow and even. But beside him, the man shifted restlessly, drumming fingers against the armrest, tapping his knee, huffing every few seconds as though everything around him was an offense. When the aircraft leveled out and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the man exhaled loudly. Chuck glanced at him only once, noting the way the man clenched and unclenched his jaw. And in that moment, he understood the truth. The man wasn't irritated by the flight. He was irritated by sitting next to Chuck Norris. There was no mistaking the hostile energy radiating off him, nor the simmering resentment in his eyes. The jealousy, the bitterness, the sense of personal injustice, all of it had taken root long before they boarded the plane. Chuck simply happened to be the nearest target. The man turned slightly, arms crossing, eyes staring ahead with cold resolve. His breathing deepened, and something settled into place in his expression, an idea, or perhaps a decision. Whatever it was, Chuck knew one thing with absolute clarity. This flight would not be as peaceful as he had hoped, and the man beside him, driven by a quiet storm inside, would soon reveal just how far he was willing to go. The tension that had quietly settled between the two men during takeoff did not fade as the aircraft leveled into its smooth cruising altitude. If anything, it thickened, slowly and almost imperceptibly, like fog rolling in across a calm field. Chuck could feel it even with his eyes closed, the restless shifting beside him, the irritated breaths, the faint tremor of suppressed frustration. The man was not simply uncomfortable. He was bracing himself, preparing for something only he understood. Chuck opened his eyes and let them travel casually across the cabin. The lights were soft. Passengers were settling into their routines, pulling out tablets, adjusting blankets, ordering drinks. There was a gentle murmur of small talk here and there, mixed with the distant clatter of utensils as the flight attendants prepared the first service. From any reasonable distance, the business class cabin seemed peaceful, but not in row 4. Beside him, the man had begun a quiet campaign of small aggressions, subtle, deniable, yet unmistakable to anyone on the receiving end. It began with the way he claimed the shared armrest, pressing his elbow outward, inch by inch, until it nudged into Chuck's space. Then came the shifting. He leaned heavily to one side, bumping into Chuck's shoulder with feigned absent-mindedness. Each time Chuck gave space, the man expanded further, as though testing the boundaries, seeking reaction. Chuck did not respond. His calmness, however, didn't ease the man. It infuriated him. The lack of visible irritation seemed to provoke something deeper, a sense of impotence that twisted his expression into something sour. He tapped his fingers restlessly, drummed his knee against the underside of the seat in front of him, and let out sharp, pointed sighs whenever a flight attendant passed by. He wasn't just annoyed. He was building momentum. When the man shifted again, this time more abruptly, his elbow collided with Chuck's arm in a way that was unmistakably intentional. Chuck turned his head slightly, offering a polite, controlled glance. The man smirked, not openly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Chuck to see the truth. This wasn't random irritability, it was purpose, a quietly brewing hostility with a direction. Chuck let his gaze fall away. He had spent a lifetime understanding people in moments quicker than breaths. The man beside him had come on board already angry. Seeing Chuck had taken that anger and sharpened it, But beneath that hostility, Chuck sensed something more complex. Insecurity, resentment, and a misguided hunger to reclaim a sense of power he felt he didn't have. The aircraft hummed through the sky, steady and calm, while the man beside him fumed in silence. It was during the drink service that the situation shifted from passive aggression to deliberate scheming. The flight attendant arrived with her warm smile and balanced tray, asking what each passenger preferred. Chuck simply requested water. The man beside him asked for sparkling water, then snapped at the attendant for bringing the wrong brand, even though it was exactly what he had ordered. She apologized professionally, but the tone of the man's voice caused several passengers to glance over. He basked in that attention for a moment, sitting up straighter, pretending to adjust his jacket. Chuck watched him with the same calm expression he had maintained since boarding, but the man could feel the eyes around him. It emboldened him. When the attendant moved on, he leaned back, crossing his arms with a puffed chest, as if he had won some small battle. Chuck turned his gaze out the window, observing the shape of clouds far below. What Chuck didn't see yet, but sensed, was the moment the man's eyes drifted downward, toward the empty seat separating them. There was a small table, folded neatly against the side of the seat, a pillow still wrapped in plastic, a blanket tucked against the armrest, a pristine leather cushion untouched by travel. It was a neutral space, belonging to neither of them. To the man beside Chuck, it became something else entirely, an opportunity. His gaze lingered on it with a calculating glint. A plan was forming, one reckless enough to make sense only to someone whose bitterness had clouded their judgment. He adjusted himself, pretending to stretch, pretending to look around. But he was measuring distance, his hand to the seat to Chuck, the reaction he hoped to provoke. Chuck caught the movement from the corner of his eye, recognizing that something had changed. The man wasn't just restless now. He had purpose. The man reached down and pulled from his bag a white plastic bottle, innocent looking, the kind used for yogurt drinks or protein shakes. But the way he held it, the careful way he unscrewed the cap, the sidelong glance he threw toward Chuck with a spark of anticipation, those details spoke loudly. Chuck felt the shift in the air, the tightening of intent, the slow, subtle preparation for a larger confrontation. He didn't react. He didn't need to. Not yet. He watched quietly as the man tilted the bottle toward himself for a sip, purely for show, then lowered it onto his lap where his hand curled around it too confidently for it to be accidental. His knee began bouncing, but not nervously, excitedly, as if he were moments from revealing some masterstroke. Chuck returned his gaze to the window again, giving the man space to commit or retreat. But retreat was not in this man's nature. The resentment smoldering inside him had grown too large. The man exhaled sharply through his nose as if bracing himself for what came next. His eyes narrowed, his fingers tightened around the bottle. All the earlier provocations had been preludes, small tests to see if Chuck would react, snap, or shift away. But when Chuck didn't move even an inch, when he refused to be manipulated by those petty games, the man's frustration reached a breaking point. He wanted Chuck gone, not because he needed the space, but because making Chuck yield would feed something hungry and hollow inside him. He stared at the empty seat once more, and Chuck, sensing the shift, felt a quiet certainty settle inside him. The storm that had been quietly brewing beside him was finally preparing to break. And this time, the man wouldn't settle for nudges or sighs. He wanted a scene, a reason, an explosion. The white bottle in his hand was no longer a drink. It was a weapon for humiliation. Chuck remained motionless, calm as the endless sky beyond the window, while beside him the man leaned forward slightly, breathing faster, readying himself to cross the line he had been circling since the moment he boarded the plane. And the fragile calm of the business-class cabin was about to be shattered. The white bottle sat in the man's hand like a small, trembling promise of trouble. Chuck sensed its significance before anything even happened. The tension beside him had coiled into something sharp and deliberate, something that now hummed with the kind of charged anticipation found in the moments before a storm finally splits open the sky. The man shifted in his seat, leaning slightly forward, pretending to study the label on the bottle as though it mattered. But his eyes flickered, not toward the text, not toward the aisle, but toward the empty leather seat between them. That seat had become the battlefield he intended to use. Chuck didn't move. He remained as he had been, calm, composed, silently observing, without giving the man the satisfaction of confrontation. His stillness only seemed to provoke the man further. The lack of emotional reaction, the quiet patience, it all fed the fire smoldering under the man's skin. It wasn't merely irritation anymore. It was obsession. He needed to provoke Chuck. He needed to disrupt his calm. He needed to feel like he had some control over this moment, over something, anything. The man raised the bottle slightly as if to drink again, though the bottle never reached his lips. Instead, he paused, glancing sideways to make sure Chuck wasn't watching too closely. Chuck kept his gaze forward, but his peripheral vision remained sharp. He saw the faint tremor of excitement run through the man's fingers as he gripped the bottle tighter. He noticed the way the man's shoulders rose, the brief inhale, the tightening of his jaw. These were the subtle gestures of someone preparing to do something wrong with full awareness of the consequences. And then, without warning, the man tilted the bottle sideways. A thick, opaque white liquid streamed out in a steady, deliberate pour, splashing onto the smooth leather seat between them. It spread quickly, pooling in the center before running along the seams and dripping slowly toward the edges. The man didn't flinch. In fact, he exhaled with a strange, almost satisfied relief, as if releasing something that had been building inside him for too long. He tilted the bottle even further, letting more liquid spill, ensuring it was unmistakable. Not a drop, not a splash, but an intentional mess. He didn't look at Chuck at first. He watched the spreading puddle instead, watched it glide over the surface like some silent declaration. Passengers nearby turned their heads, drawn by the sound of liquid hitting leather or the sudden shift in atmosphere. A woman across the aisle frowned in confusion. A man 2 rows ahead glanced back in irritation. Someone farther behind whispered something to a companion, their voice rising in quiet surprise. Only then did the man turn his head, slowly, deliberately, to face Chuck. His expression was triumphant. He waited for the reaction, a flinch, a frown, an annoyed sigh, anything. But Chuck simply watched the liquid pool and spread, his gaze steady, completely unshaken. No anger, no surprise, not even the faintest sign of inconvenience. That calmness pierced deeper than any angry response would have. It infuriated the man. His smugness faltered, twisting into a scowl of disbelief. He had expected disruption. He had expected to force Chuck's hand, to pressure him into calling for a flight attendant, into demanding a new seat, into abandoning the row altogether. But Chuck remained motionless, silent, as if the mess had nothing to do with him. The man's breathing quickened, his shoulders tightening. He had crossed the line, had executed his grand gesture of provocation, and it had failed. The flight attendant approached promptly, alerted by murmurs and glances. She paused when she saw the mess, her expression shifting from professional calm to concerned confusion. The man jumped ahead of the situation, raising his hands in exaggerated embarrassment. "Oh no," he said, voice artificially strained with regret. "Clumsy me. I must have tipped it by accident." His performance was practiced. The guilt in his tone was faked, the nervous laugh too rehearsed. He even dabbed half-heartedly at the liquid with a napkin that did absolutely nothing to help. The attendant hesitated. She wasn't entirely convinced, but she also lacked proof to challenge him. He hadn't shouted at anyone. He hadn't caused physical harm. He had made a mess, nothing more. In the strict confines of airline policy, this was irritating, but not grounds for removal. Still, his behavior unsettled her. She offered to find cleaning supplies, apologized to Chuck, and promised to return shortly. She walked away quickly, glancing back one more time, her brows knit in worry. Chuck acknowledged her apology with a gentle nod, but said nothing else, and the man noticed that too. The calmness, the acceptance, the lack of anger. It was unbearable. The white liquid continued to spread, creating an ugly, sticky island of discomfort between them. The man stared at it. It was supposed to be his victory. It was supposed to be the moment Chuck gave up, called for a seat change, and retreated from the row in defeat. But instead, Chuck sat there, quiet as stone, unchanged, as if the mess were irrelevant. The man's lips twitched with irritation. He tightened his grip on the half-empty bottle. His plan hadn't worked. The failure settled into him like a cold wave, and something inside him snapped. The quiet, the calm, the unshakable poise. It all made him feel invisible, insignificant, powerless. He had wanted to force Chuck out of the seat, but now he needed something else entirely. He needed to break the calm. He needed a reaction. Around them, passengers continued to watch. Their curiosity had evolved into something sharper anticipation. They sensed the strangeness of the moment, the imbalance between the man's aggression and Chuck's serenity. Phones were angled subtly, just low enough to avoid detection, but high enough to catch the edge of the unfolding tension. The man sank slightly into his seat, his breath unsteady. The bottle rested against his knee, white residue coating the edges. His fingers tapped against it in short, angry bursts. He looked at Chuck again, but this time there was no triumph, only a desperate, simmering need for control. Chuck finally turned his head, meeting the man's eyes with a gaze that was neither confrontational nor dismissive, just quietly aware. And that, more than anything, seemed to unravel the man from the inside. The failure of the first provocation became the fuel for a deeper escalation. He would not accept defeat. Not from Chuck. Not today. The mess was only the beginning. The man's resentment had not been satisfied. It had been starved. And now, with trembling hands and burning humiliation, he began to imagine his next move. The white mess between them had dried only slightly, leaving behind a sticky sheen across the smooth leather. But the tension in the air had grown far thicker than any physical substance. What had started as a desperate attempt to provoke Chuck had now become a quiet humiliation pressing down on the man, like a weight he could neither shake off nor ignore. His failed performance gnawed at him. Every second of Chuck's calm, every breath the actor took with unbroken composure, felt like a personal insult. The silence of the row was no longer neutral. For the man, it felt mocking. He shifted restlessly, unable to sit still. His elbow slid aggressively onto the shared armrest again, this time with more force. He pressed his shoulder outward, bumping Chuck without any attempt at subtlety. The contact was unmistakably intentional. Chuck looked at him, not sharply, not angrily, but with that same steady, unshaken expression that had tormented the man from the start. That simple look, almost gentle, carried a quiet certainty that made the man feel smaller than he wanted to admit. Passengers had begun paying attention openly now. Some watched with curious glances, others with thinly veiled concern. Even the flight attendants moved through the cabin more cautiously, glancing toward the row as if expecting the atmosphere to crack. The man could sense eyes on him, people judging, people displeased, people waiting. Instead of humbling him, it fueled him. His pride was wounded, his resentment burning now with a hotter, more reckless flame. If the spilled liquid hadn't pushed Chuck out of the row, maybe something else would. He leaned forward abruptly and reached down into his bag. His arm brushed Chuck again, harder this time, as though the accidental contact was merely an excuse for aggression. He pulled out a smaller container, barely larger than a juice box, with a foil top half peeled back. His fingers trembled around it, not out of fear, but out of the internal fury he was barely containing. The thick scent of something sweet drifted from the opening. Even before he lifted it, passengers nearby seemed to understand that he was not reaching for a drink. Chuck's attention flicked subtly toward the container, not in alarm but in recognition. He understood the man's intentions now with perfect clarity. The first provocation had failed, and instead of accepting it, the man had taken it as a challenge, a personal affront that required escalation. He was going to spill something again. He wanted to make the seat unbearable, to make the space intolerable, to force Chuck out not through accident, not through chance, but through sheer persistence. Chuck remained still, but his awareness sharpened like a blade. He had always known that some people, when denied the reaction they sought, erupted into increasingly irrational behavior. The man beside him was one of those people. Once he had set his mind on humiliating Chuck, he wouldn't stop until he felt victorious, or until someone stopped him. The man tore the rest of the foil back with unnecessary force, splattering a few drops of liquid onto his own sleeve. He didn't notice. His eyes were locked onto the empty seat, onto the already spoiled leather, onto the white streaks drying into a tacky residue. He positioned his hand carefully above the seat again, but this time, the gesture carried no hesitation, no attempt at deception. It was pure intent, raw, unmasked, reckless. Before he poured, he gave Chuck a lingering look, a silent dare, a demand for reaction. The resentment in his gaze had grown darker, almost feverish, tightened by the emotion he had allowed to spiral unchecked. His lips pressed together in a thin line as he inhaled sharply, preparing for his self-appointed triumph. Chuck didn't move. His stillness wasn't passive, it was deliberate, a silent warning the man was too blinded to recognize. The man tipped the container. Another wave of thick white liquid hit the seat with a louder splash than before, splattering across the already ruined leather and dripping down toward the floor. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the cabin. Someone gasped softly. A man across the aisle straightened, frowning. A woman covered her mouth. The atmosphere around the row tightened like a fist. This time, the man didn't even pretend it was an accident. He wanted everyone to see. He wanted everyone to know. His face held a twisted kind of pride as he watched the mess spread. He had crossed a boundary that most passengers, even the most impulsive, instinctively understood not to cross. The nearest flight attendant rushed over, panic flashing in her eyes as she saw the fresh mess dripping from the seat and gathering in a small pool at the edge. Her voice cracked slightly when she asked what had happened, trying to maintain professionalism, but her alarm was thinly veiled. The man shrugged with a smug, unapologetic tilt of his shoulders and muttered something about turbulence, a claim so blatant in its dishonesty that even the passengers around him silently scoffed. But he knew, and Chuck knew, that the flight attendant's hands were tied. He hadn't attacked anyone. He hadn't caused a safety hazard. He had merely made a mess, a terrible, unnecessary, disruptive mess, but one that didn't qualify as grounds for removal at cruising altitude. The crew couldn't restrain him for spilling something. They could only issue warnings which he clearly intended to ignore. The faces in the surrounding rows showed a mix of discomfort and tension. People could feel the situation escalating beyond something trivial or childish. They sensed that something deeper, something uglier, was taking shape at the center of it all. The man's rage had become unstable, unpredictable. His need to assert himself had grown into a reckless, boiling force. Chuck turned his head slightly, catching a clear view of the man's face. The man's breathing was uneven. His hand, still clutching the empty container, trembled with adrenaline. His expression wasn't triumphant anymore. It was strained, unhinged. The anger that had begun as irritation had grown into something consuming, something that no longer resembled confidence, but desperation. He wasn't trying to inconvenience Chuck anymore. He was trying to break him. He wanted Chuck to react, not just by moving seats or calling a flight attendant, but by losing composure. He wanted to prove something twisted to himself, and maybe to the strangers watching. He wanted to drag Chuck into his chaos. Chuck, however, remained unmoved, not because he didn't care, but because he understood exactly what the man was trying to achieve. Chaos had a way of seeking its equal, but Chuck was not about to offer it. The attendant returned with more towels, kneeling beside the seat as she tried futilely to contain the spreading mess. Her hands shook slightly, her patience stretched thin as she glanced up at the man with disbelief bordering on frustration. He pretended not to notice, but his foot tapped rapidly against the carpet, giving away his agitation. Chuck watched her, appreciating her effort, understanding her discomfort, and respecting her professionalism. But something deeper stirred within him, not anger, not irritation, but a quiet certainty that this would not end with spilled liquid and irritated glances. The man was going to push further. He had lost control of whatever restraint he once had. The air in the cabin felt heavier. Even the hum of the engines seemed distant beneath the weight of tension now settling between the rows. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, each sensing that the man had crossed not just a literal boundary, but an emotional one. And Chuck, with the calm intuition of a man who had weathered storms far greater than this, understood that the next moment would mark the true turning point. The man wasn't satisfied. The escalation wasn't finished. The next move he prepared would go beyond spilled liquid and petty provocations. He would push until someone or something stopped him. The calm before that inevitability stretched thin, trembling under the strain, and Chuck knew the moment of intervention was rapidly approaching. The tension that had been building throughout the flight had reached a point where even the hum of the engines felt muted beneath it. The business class cabin was no longer a quiet refuge for travelers. It had become a stage balanced on the edge of something inevitable. Passengers who once sat relaxed with headphones or open books were now frozen in uneasy anticipation, their eyes shifting between the man and Chuck as though tracking two ends of a tightening wire. The crew avoided lingering in the aisle, moving with the hesitant awareness of people who could feel confrontation approaching, but lacked the authority to stop it. The man sat hunched forward now, elbows on his knees, empty container dangling from his hand. His leg bounced uncontrollably, a rapid, jittery motion that betrayed just how frayed his nerves had become. What he had expected to be a small triumph forcing Chuck out of the seat had turned into something else entirely. He had hoped that spilling liquid once or twice would be enough to make Chuck retreat, to embarrass him, to create a victory the man could savor. But Chuck hadn't flinched. He hadn't relocated. He hadn't reacted. That calm resistance only deepened the man's fixation. His frustration had grown into something raw and volatile, something that pressed against the edges of reason and begged to spill over. He needed another act, something final, something that would force a reaction, any reaction, from the man beside him who refused to be provoked. Chuck sensed it, the subtle shift in the man's breathing, the trembling in his hands, the way he leaned toward his bag with a frantic determination that no longer resembled a coherent plan, but sheer impulse. Chuck had seen people reach this point before. The moment when rational thought dissolved and only the desire to lash out remained. He didn't know whether the man wanted to spill something else, throw something, or escalate the confrontation physically, but the look in his eyes was enough to confirm that he had crossed an internal line. The man reached into his bag again, rummaging with jerky movements, knocking against the seat in front of him hard enough for the passenger there to look back in alarm. His hand closed around another item, a larger plastic squeeze bottle, its cap still tightly sealed. A few passengers gasped softly when they realized what he intended to do. The man pulled the bottle out with a triumphant jerk, gripping it like a weapon he believed would deliver the victory he sought. His breath came in harsh, uneven bursts as he positioned the bottle over the ruined seat, ready to unleash yet another wave of sticky white liquid. That was the moment Chuck moved. It was not dramatic. It was not aggressive. It was not even fast in the way that startled people. It simply happened with a quiet, precise certainty that made everyone around them fall silent. Chuck rose from his seat in one smooth motion, the kind of controlled, effortless movement that spoke of deep experience rather than brute strength. His hand reached out, steady and deliberate, intercepting the man's wrist before the bottle could be tilted. The man froze, stunned. He had expected shouting, maybe grabbing, maybe a struggle. He hadn't expected this kind of intervention, calm, firm, undeniable. Chuck's fingers closed around the man's wrist with the gentleness of someone handling something fragile, yet with the unyielding strength of someone who could not be shaken. The man tried to pull his arm back, but Chuck's grip didn't budge. The bottle slid from the man's fingers, tumbling harmlessly onto the seat, rolling slightly before coming to rest in the mess he had already created. The sudden stillness in the row was overwhelming. Passengers leaned in, their breath held. The hum of the engines returned to awareness like background music behind a frozen scene. The man blinked, startled and frightened. Whatever distorted confidence had driven him up until now seemed to dissipate instantly under the weight of Chuck's calm presence. The reckless bravado evaporated, revealing something smaller underneath. Fear, confusion, a sense of losing control. Chuck stepped slightly closer, gently guiding the man's captured wrist downward. The motion was controlled, but without force, as though he were redirecting rather than restraining. Before the man could fully comprehend what was happening, Chuck rotated his arm, applying just enough subtle pressure to turn his shoulders and guide him back toward his seat. The movement was so smooth, it almost looked choreographed. The man let out a startled gasp as he found himself pressed against the back of the seat, unable to resist. Chuck wasn't violent. He didn't twist or wrench. He simply positioned the man in a way that made struggling useless without causing pain. A faint shiver of panic coursed through the man as he realized his own body had been moved into complete stillness without effort. Chuck reached for the seatbelt with the same calm efficiency, pulling the strap across the man's torso. The man tried to lift his arm, but Chuck's hand remained on his shoulder, steady and reassuringly firm. In seconds, the belt clicked into place, securing him with a finality that made the man's eyes widen. No one spoke. Even the man's breathing quieted into shallow, rapid bursts of disbelief. Chuck stepped back, releasing him. The man remained pinned in place, not because he was held, but because he no longer dared move. His entire body was locked in a mix of shock and humiliation. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Only then did Chuck look at him, and the look was not harsh. It was disappointed, calm, grounded in a strength the man could neither understand nor match. Chuck didn't need to speak. His silence carried more weight than words could have. A murmur rose around them, whispers of astonishment, relief, awe. Some passengers clapped softly, too overwhelmed to restrain themselves. Others simply shook their heads, grateful that the escalating madness had finally been cut off before something worse occurred. A flight attendant approached, her face pale, her hands clasped together in front of her as she tried to absorb what had happened. She had witnessed the tail end of the confrontation, enough to understand that Chuck had prevented a far more disruptive incident. Her eyes darted from the man to Chuck and back, and she exhaled shakily as she thanked Chuck in a quiet, earnest voice. Chuck nodded, offering a modest, understated acknowledgement before returning to his seat with the same calm he had maintained from the beginning. There was no triumph in his demeanor, no arrogance, only a composed acceptance of what had needed to be done. The man sat restrained, sweating, trembling, staring straight ahead as if afraid to move even a muscle. His reckless confidence had collapsed entirely, replaced by the deep, sinking realization that he had pushed too far, gone too deep into something he was wholly unprepared to face. And the cabin, once tense with anticipation, now settled into a stunned, reverent quiet. Everyone understood that the situation had reached its turning point, and that from here on, the consequences would unfold, not with drama, but with certainty. The cabin seemed to exhale after the confrontation resolved itself, as though every passenger had been holding their breath for far too long. The echoes of the soft applause died out gradually, fading into a stunned silence filled only by the steady drone of the aircraft slicing through the sky. What had just happened hovered in the air, like a moment frozen in amber, impossible to ignore, unforgettable, and strangely dignified in its execution. Chuck settled back into his seat with a composed calmness that contrasted sharply with the trembling mess of a man beside him. The man sat rigidly, eyes wide and unfocused, his breath uneven, as though he were experiencing the aftermath of a nightmare he had created for himself. His gaze flickered to the sticky mess on the seat beside him, then to the tightly fastened belt across his chest, and finally to his own hands, which now lay limp and useless atop his lap. He moved as little as possible, fearful that any gesture might reignite a conflict he was no longer capable of navigating. His earlier arrogance had evaporated completely, leaving behind only raw humiliation and an acute awareness of the gravity of what he had done. It hung on him like a heavy cloak, suffocating in its weight. The closest flight attendant approached tentatively, glancing between the restrained man and Chuck with gratitude and disbelief mingling in her features. She had witnessed the danger spiraling out of control, and she knew her intervention alone would not have been enough to contain it. Her voice shook slightly as she assured Chuck that security officers would be notified immediately upon landing. Chuck responded with a small nod, neither proud nor dismissive, simply acknowledging the necessity of her protocol. Word traveled quickly among the flight attendants, and soon the cabin crew operated with a new level of gravity. Their movements were quieter, their tones more measured, as though they wanted to maintain the fragile stability that now held the space together. Passengers returned to their seats cautiously, though none of them fully sank back into the comfort they had enjoyed earlier. Instead, they stole occasional glances toward Chuck and the restrained man, sharing silent looks of understanding. The tension had broken, yes, but no one would forget the reason it had formed. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching as the plane descended toward its destination. The light outside the window shifted from a bright midday glare to a softer, warmer glow as the aircraft began its gradual approach. The clouds thinned, revealing the sprawling city below, a grid of roads glistening in the afternoon sun, cars inching like tiny insects across the maze of streets. Chuck watched the landscape with a quiet concentration, his expression serene, as though observing the ordinary beauty of descent helped ease the final remnants of tension from the air. Beside him, the man's breathing grew shallower. The movement of the plane as it tilted and leveled, dipped and adjusted, caused him to tense further against his restraints. He swallowed repeatedly, eyes darting in anxious spurts whenever a flight attendant passed near. His earlier fury now seemed incomprehensible even to him, replaced instead by fear of what awaited once the wheels touched the ground. He wasn't thinking about pride anymore. He was thinking about consequences. When the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing final descent, the man's head dropped slightly, his shoulders slumping as reality pressed hard against him. The announcement was routine, but for him it carried the weight of inevitability. Chuck felt the subtle shift in the man's energy, but said nothing. He didn't need to. His role in the altercation had already ended the moment he had restrained the man. Everything that came next belonged to airport officials, not him. As the landing gear extended and the plane dipped through the lower atmosphere, the tension in the cabin evolved from anxiety to anticipation. Passengers sat upright, fastening seatbelts, closing tray tables, aligning their posture for touchdown. The business class cabin filled with the soft rustle of fabric and the muted clicks of belts locking into place. The runway rose up to meet them. The tires struck the ground with a loud, shuddering thump, followed by a rapid succession of vibrations as the brakes engaged. The engines roared, pushing the plane forward before gradually releasing into a gentler hum. The touchdown was smooth, but the atmosphere inside remained tight. And then, as the plane slowed and turned off the runway, it became clear that something unusual awaited. Several airport security officers were standing at the gate area, visible through the small oval windows as the plane aligned with the jet bridge. Their uniforms were crisp, their posture alert, their presence unmistakable. The man beside Chuck saw them too. He tensed visibly, his face paling as he sank further into the seat, his eyes wide with fear. He tugged instinctively at his belt, forgetting that it was cinched tightly, but Chuck's earlier precision made it impossible for him to escape. He gave up within seconds, his head dropping, his breathing ragged. Chuck didn't look at him. He didn't need to witness the man's crumbling composure. He simply waited for the door to open. When it did, the cabin filled with a sudden influx of fresh, cool air and the sharp scent of airport corridors. The first officer stepped inside, followed closely by security personnel. They moved with quiet purpose, their eyes scanning the passengers before settling with immediate certainty on the restrained man. The lead officer leaned down and spoke to him in a calm, controlled tone. The man muttered something, an apology, an excuse, perhaps even a plea, but the officers did not waver. They freed his belt only to secure him with their own restraints, ensuring he couldn't act out in the walkway. His head hung low as they escorted him down the aisle, past rows of passengers who watched in silence. Some eyes were sympathetic, others were cold, all were judgmental. When the man reached the front, one of the officers nodded respectfully toward Chuck, acknowledging what had happened without needing to articulate it. Chuck returned a brief nod, nothing more. He didn't dwell on the moment. Once they had escorted the man off the plane, the aisle cleared, and passengers began gathering their belongings. The tension finally began to dissipate in small, gradual waves. Chuck rose, collected his bag from the overhead bin, and tied his jacket around one arm. He stepped into the aisle without hurry, moving with the same steady, grounded presence that had defined him throughout the entire ordeal. The flight attendants thanked him again as he exited, their voices filled with sincerity. Several passengers echoed the sentiment through nods and soft words, but Chuck simply offered polite acknowledgments. He didn't linger. He didn't revel in attention. He walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal as though nothing remarkable had occurred. Outside, the airport bustled with its usual rhythm-rolling suitcases, overlapping conversations, announcements offering directions and warnings. The world resumed its ordinary chaos. But for those on that flight, the story would not end here. They would tell it to friends, retell it to strangers, exaggerate or analyze it, replaying the scene of Chuck standing with unshakable calm as an unhinged man pushed himself into humiliation. A few would post the videos online, millions would watch, and the lesson would remain the same, repeated in comment sections and retellings with the same blunt finality. Trying to force Chuck Norris out of his seat doesn't end with Chuck moving. It ends with you losing yours. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. And make sure to check out our next episodes and other stories. You definitely don't want to miss what's coming next.